Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 106. Today's guest is Jon Sands. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is poet Jon Sands. Jon Sands is a winner of the 2018 National Poetry Series, selected for his second book, It's Not Magic, published by Beacon Press in 2019. He is the author of The New Clean, the co-host of the Poetry Gods podcast, and a curator for Supa Dupa Fresh, a monthly reading series at Ode to Babel in Brooklyn. His work has been featured in the New York Times as well as anthologized in the Best American Poetry. He teaches at Brooklyn College, Urban Word NYC, and facilitates a weekly writing workshop for adults at Bailey House, an HIV/AIDS service center in East Harlem. He tours extensively as a poet, but lives in Brooklyn. I was a humongous fan of Jon's podcast, The Poetry Gods, which he co-hosted with Aziza Barnes and Jose Olivares. Longtime listeners will remember Jose from episode 33. The Poetry Gods was hugely formative for me, both as a reader and as a podcaster. It introduced me to a whole bunch of poets who have since become favorites, and some of whom I've been lucky enough to get to talk with here on Keep the Channel Open. And it was really great for showing me how literary conversations could be both deep and fun, and that you could host a show while still being yourself. So then, of course, when I saw that Jon had a new book coming out, it went right on my to-read list. I'd enjoyed Jon's first book, The New Clean, when I read it a while back, and so I was really looking forward to this one, It's Not Magic. And what I've found is a book that is full of poems that are sensitive, joyful, introspective, and which are deeply invested in honesty. And that's something that really resonated with me because I am also a person who is at times obsessed with memory, not just from a nostalgic place, but from a place of wanting to understand what are the things that made me who I am. What do I remember? And what did I take away at the time? And what can I learn about myself and others and the world by revisiting these memories now? And that's very much what these poems are doing. I've put a link in the show notes to where you can pick up your own copy, and I do highly recommend it. A quick note before we get started. Towards the end of the first segment, Jon and I talk about two of his poems that deal with issues of consent and power dynamics and the real-life experience that informed the poems. That starts around the 27-minute mark and lasts about 15 minutes, just so you know. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Jon Sands. So how are you today?
I'm good. Yeah.
All right. Well, before we do anything else, I just wanted to say how much I really enjoyed this collection. And also, since I've got you here, I wanted to say just how much I really loved, how much I miss, and how formative the Poetry Gods was for me as a podcaster. So I just wanted to, since I've got you here, say thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. The Poetry Gods was formative for me in so many different ways.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
And you were, when I think about kind of the community that got built around this thing, that we truly started around a voice memo with the three of us and sent it to a couple people like, this is probably just for us. And people were like, no, you should do it. You should get a logo and make it. And then that people tuned into it and that people, I don't know, engaged us in conversation around it, that people still come up to me at readings and stuff and talk about the Poetry Gods. It's so funny because, you have all these private conversations with your friends. I feel lucky enough to have moved to New York at a time when that just kind of coincided with a lot of people who were moving here. And I think like anyone who has a passion, just slowly your friends become the people, not all of your friends, but a lot of your friends become the people who love what you love. And then the line between, talking shop and being friends is so blurred because, everything that's on that podcast is literally just what it would be when Jose and Aziza and I get up for a drink or something like that. Like, it's not different.
Yeah.
And so that kind of lends itself a privacy that I think allowed us to just actually say what was on our mind, because I think on some level we truly didn't believe that it was going to be public, even though we were making it public.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. You know?
No, totally. I totally get it. It's funny because a lot of the same sort of motivations that you're describing are why I ended up starting this show. And for me, it was photography, but just hanging around talking with my photographer friends and realizing like, I want to have more of these conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like there were just so many gems. I think maybe in some ways it's because the three of us have teaching artist backgrounds, which are really different. I mean, all of us at this point have done teaching in academia and in, university settings and stuff. But to be a teaching artist is really to be inherently flexible and kind of you're balancing two things, which honestly, the best professors that I had in my MFA or any of that, world also did these things, but it really is based around writing instruction and having actual tools to offer and creative ways to get there. But you're also a curator. You're also needing to think as an educator how important it is to create an environment into which people can find the permission to say something that is inherently them. And so as a host and as a space creator, it really was about, not bringing people's walls down in any nefarious way, but it's like, how do we create an environment that feels good enough that someone can kind of sink into the couch and give us an honest answer and feel comfortable enough in their own body to really try to access something. And so there were just things that guests shared with us that I will literally just never forget.
Yeah. It's an interesting coincidence. By the time this airs, it'll already have happened. But right now, I'm prepping for. I'm going to be moderating a panel at AWP, all about the craft of the literary podcast interview, and the things that you were just saying. How do we make a space for these things to just sort of organically happen? Is something I think about all the time, and it's something that I'm going to be asking my other panelists about. And the Poetry Gods was really, really one of the shows that helped me figure out how to think about things like that. But anyway, I do want to talk about your book too.
Yeah, definitely. We could talk about the Poetry Gods all day.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, can we start with the reading?
Yes, of course. This maybe is a little bit of context. Not that I think the poem necessarily needs the context, but there are a couple poems in this book that I feel like once they were written, they were almost like corks that got pulled, and then a whole series of poems flooded in behind them. And this poem got written after I was at this old night called Urbana that was in New York City for a long time. And they had a open mic, they would have a poetry slam, and then they had a fantastic DJ. And at the time, the DJ was Rico Frederick, who's a great poet. And I was there one night, and I had been writing all of these love poems kind of to, at times to no one. It was almost like I was truly trying to, spell cast myself away from loneliness. And you have this realization sometimes as a writer, at least if you're, in the school of writing that I kind of subscribe to, where, sometimes your poems are actually braver than you. And I was writing things, and yet I was still kind of going home and keeping my walls where they were. And I just had this experience where I was at this night and a few other things that were going on in my life at the time. And so I sat down, and a lot of poems get heavily edited, obviously, but this one came out, it was pretty close to this when I wrote it. So yeah, it goes like this. I threw my hands from my wrists because I liked the way the beat sniffed around the speakers like a dog searching for the right place to shit. My butt was against my blue jeans, against the ripped leather of some couch, listening to some beautiful poet profess what they dreamt about once, because we are scared to write out the new dreams because they are happening right now. Which is a good time to tell you that I am not alone. I am next to one hot cup of soup. She could melt the wax off a wick if you catch my baseball. Now, I don't know her. It's just two people, one couch, and a bundle of old dreams. But I cross my left leg in her direction like a knight if the couch were a chessboard. And in my newest dream, I think I see her see me. I think I see her adjust her butt against her pants against the leather right now, which is a good time to tell you that my heart has not been working right. It is a cold bowl of wax. It could freeze the juice off a mango. I have been carrying this pistachio in my ribs for months. I have been trusting people only when I write about them. I have been straight to voicemail. I have been sewing a dress from all of these books and wearing it to my one-man prom. And I don't know what her hair smells like, but I want to. And I don't know what her mother's name is, but I want to send her an email questionnaire. I want to reach my arm to the right now, which is a good time to tell you that she is actually two ladies, and only one I got an email from that said she'd only met me, but she knew me. She only knew me, but she loved me. And I said, I don't believe in magic outside of my poems. I said, you can't love me. All I did was write a book. And she still wrote back. Only one did I like the comment she made on someone else's Facebook status. And it isn't the one right here, but my elbows heard the beat ride out the speakers on horseback, and my shoulders got yanked by some invisible lasso. And I am talking to the air with my entire body. And if I was waiting for the perfect time to say, how do you do? For an invitation to a dinner party, for a flowchart to say trust is a risk like poetry, for a sign to spark in the back of all these old dreams that said, John, let it ride. I am already 30, old enough to know one day my heart will shut down altogether. And I get to choose for what?
That thing that you said, first of all, thank you.
Yeah.
I always love hearing you read. That thing that you said about being braver when you're writing than maybe you are just in your life was something that really resonated with me. It's something that I've talked about with other writers from time to time. It certainly feels very much like how I am as well. And I think it's probably a pretty common thing for writers, you know, like there's something about the page that gives you permission in ways that just being a person doesn't always feel like you have. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a real freedom to sit down and, you know, at first you feel beholden to whatever forces are around you, but hopefully as a writer, what you cultivate in the quiet is the permission to write something that's just yours. And then you have to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah.
And so I oftentimes feel like, I don't know, some of the more braver poems that I've ever written, it's not like they go straight into a book. I mean, they're oftentimes, and this is where having a good community around you matters, is there are oftentimes things that I can call up a friend or send an email and be like, hey, can I say this? You know, like, this is what I said.
Yeah.
And now I need to know if it's something that has legs, you know? And then they kind of trickle out into being shareable, and then you become accountable to them in some ways, these poems that you make. But also, you know, I think there are a lot of different schools of writing, and that's something I'm really growing to appreciate, that it's vast enough that people have incredibly different values around it. But for me, oftentimes when I'm writing, I'm truly trying to work something out. I'm trying to name something. And oftentimes answers feel so far away that I'm just trying to sharpen a naming of reality that feels accurate. And in doing so, you know, there are poems like that where I'm literally sitting there writing, and, you know, obviously there's craft to it, but I'm almost daring the me who is me to be vulnerable. And I think it's, if you're the you who's, both the writer and outside of the poem, it really behooves us to listen to the poems that we're writing to ourselves. Like oftentimes I feel like the poem creates the door, but it's on the person to walk through it.
I think it's so interesting. This was something that you talked about. You did an interview with Barely South Review late last year. And this thing about not knowing, maybe the poem is scary, like the writing of the poem is scary, putting it out into the world. You don't know if somebody's going to judge you for it, kind of thing. You had this thing that you said in that interview, which I thought was really interesting and really kind of like rang a bell in my brain, which was that shame is like a stovetop and we can't keep our finger there long enough to see what it actually is.
Yeah.
And that a good poem for you turns the temperature down long enough to get an accurate read. I'm really interested in this because I think I approach writing, and especially poetry, in a very similar way to what you're describing, where I am sort of, for me, oftentimes when I'm writing a poem, it's because by the time it gets to the point where I am even conceiving of it as being a poem, I've been thinking about it for a while.
Yeah.
And it's something I can't let go of. It's something that I'm sort of almost obsessed with, maybe. And so the writing of it is a way to work through it. But a lot of times, the thing that I am thinking about is either an experience of shame that I'm remembering or an experience of shame that I'm anticipating because of the writing. So this way that you were talking about shame and writing was really interesting to me. And I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I think that it's a real dance. Like when I say that a good poem turns the temperature down, in a way, you're also turning the shame down. I'm not concerned in my poems when I'm writing them for me, which is different than the fear of putting them out in the world, which is, maybe another topic that we can talk about. But, when I'm writing them for me, I'm really not concerned with being the hero of the poem. I feel oftentimes like the poems that I grow the most from are the ones that have a certain level of introspection that involves me portraying myself in less than good light. However, I do think that part of turning that temperature down is also being in a space to kind of have enough self-love or compassion that if you try to come to the poem with an overflow of shame, it doesn't work. Like there are poems that I tried to write over and over again, and I'm just like, ooh, this doesn't taste right. It's not the poem's not very good. And it's because I'm not believing myself enough in this moment. I think I'm at confession, but what I'm actually at is Accuracyville. And Accuracyville is that you, the writer, are worthy because you're alive. And that doesn't mean that you're perfect, right? But like, I don't know. I'm always suspicious when my poems are devoid of joy or playfulness. And on the flip side, also when they're devoid, sometimes I'll get so playful and joyful that I am almost hiding from saying anything that matters in the first place, right? So oftentimes it becomes about balance and trying to actually bring your full self to whatever it is that you're describing.
Yeah. That balance that you're describing between joy and, I'm not sure exactly what the right word is, but the one that was coming to me was accountability. Seemed like really, really central to basically the collection as a whole and almost every single poem in the collection, because so many of the poems here have this exuberance to them, whether you're writing a love poem in and describing an interaction, or I don't know if it, it doesn't really matter, I guess, but it's like if it's a real interaction or an imagined interaction, or whether the poem itself is the interaction, or whether you're describing a memory from your younger days, there is this energy, there's this excitement and exuberance to it that is very palpable. And yet in so many of these poems, there's also this way that it doesn't stay right in that moment of exuberance. Like a lot of times when you're talking about a memory from your younger days, you then back off in a more sort of like authorial kind of voice, where then you say, but this is actually what that meant. You know what I mean? I'm particularly thinking of like one of the first ones that really struck me that way was Moon's Over My Hammy.
Yeah.
And there's this line in there where, I wrote it down. It was, you say, man to man, to follow through with a skit like that is the kind of thing that damages someone for life. And that line, I feel like it kind of turns everything that came before, it kind of turns it a little bit so that you, the reader, understand it differently than just that sort of youthful exuberance. And I thought, to me, that was a really, interesting, but also emotionally resonant way of doing it. I feel like I have this way of doing a similar thing when I'm interfacing with memory.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think oftentimes it's about accuracy. And that's another poem that was a cork puller. It was, I just had the first line because I was doing a show called the Encyclopedia Show, and everyone had to get assigned, everyone is kind of, what's it called, commissioned for a new poem around a general theme. And the theme for that night was the moon. And then everyone had kind of subtopics, which were like moon pies and, Sailor Moon. And mine was Moon's Over My Hammy. And it was a Denny's breakfast sandwich. And I had all these like just stories about high school. It was really a time in my adult life where I had felt myself being, I think I was probably 28, something around there when I wrote that, 28, 29. And it was like, I'm 28, I'm 16. Like emotionally, something happens and then I'm 16. And I found myself really thinking so much about high school, and then kind of just started writing that poem as fast as I could. And, you get a lot of joy in kind of late night Waffle House and drinking games. But I felt like there was no way to fully try to capture, which I think that poem is trying to do, is try to capture this high school experience emotionally in one night, kind of 4 years packed into one night. And I honestly, it's not about searching out. It's not like I was sitting there and was like, what we really need here to complicate things is that you have all these kind of youthfully exuberant boys, and they need to write a senior skit that trivializes and honestly, not just trivializes, but kind of takes someone else's personal story and puts it on Front Street in a way that can be incredibly damaging. And it's not like I just sit there and be like, man, that's what we need. It's like, that's what we did. And so a lot of times that kind of complexity is something that I think you want to be loose enough as a writer to allow it in, because it wants to come in. That's the accurate representation of who we were. And that's a truth that we have to reckon with. Certainly, if we're looking to, as Patricia Smith says, kind of unstun narratives and allow them to move forward. And I just, I really don't go in search of it. Like it's already there. It's already asking to come in. And we as writers are like, well, we can't say that. It's like, but that's what happened.
I do think, though, it's not, I mean, I believe you when you say you're not going looking for it, right? But I also feel like, maybe what you're saying is that you do have to, I guess what I think is, a lot of people, if they look back at themselves when they're younger, or there's this way that we have of nobody wants to feel shame about things, and most people don't even really want to feel complexly about themselves,
Yeah.
And so like having the opportunity to say, well, yes, that is what happened, and this is what it meant, and it was this, and it was that, it was both of those things. Like, I don't think every writer does that, but I think that, at least for me, the writers that really are able to make things that mean something to me in particular are ones where you can sit in the bothness of it, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and that as a reader, those aren't just the voices that I trust, but they're the voices that I gravitate towards. They're the voices that feel resonant to me, the ones that want to allow the complexity of the telling to happen. I'm not saying it exactly right, but I do think that, I don't know, there are just moments in a poem, and it makes it seem like, well, you can't say that to someone else, you know? You can't say out loud to someone else that you did something bad, let alone in high school, but as an adult, you know? But I don't think that's the hard part. Honestly, I think the hard part is people saying it to themselves. I think the hard part is writing and admitting to yourself, a kind of accuracy that allows you to grow. And of course, on the growth is great, and vulnerability is terrible, but it's like the path that you have to take towards growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. Yeah. For me, growth is everything. It's like, it's all that I want.
Yeah. There's another poem. There's actually it's like a 2-poem sort of duet almost that happens towards the end of this book that I wanted to talk about. And it kind of gets at something that has to do with what we're talking about here. And so these 2 poems are The Basement and Above Ground.
Yeah.
Like for me, this thing that you're saying about admitting it to yourself is the hard part kind of thing. Mm-hmm. For me, it's almost the opposite. A lot of times when I'm thinking about my younger self and what makes it difficult to make art out of it is that I'm still, even if these are things that might have happened, like 25 years ago, I can still be so wrapped up in the shame of it, right? That you can't, nobody wants to read a poem in which the poet is just flagellating themselves, right?
100%. 100%.
That's not like a useful thing for anybody, and it's not enjoyable either, right? So the difficulty that I have is not admitting to myself like there was a thing that I did that was bad when I was a kid or even when I was an adult. It's more like that somebody else who was involved in that situation we can agree on some of the details, but they might remember it in a really different way. Mm-hmm. And letting in the possibility that I might not have been like completely irredeemable as a child is the harder thing for me. These 2 poems I found really, really interesting from this perspective of that complexity, because what the encounter that you describe in the first poem, in The Basement, is this encounter that you had with this. I don't know if I'm supposed to say you when we're talking about poems, right?
I'm the speaker in that poem.
This encounter that you have with this girl that you liked, and it kind of goes poorly. Then in the second poem, you describe, many years later, talking it over with this woman who was the girl that you had that interaction with.
Yeah.
And it kind of seems like the way that she took what she took away from that interaction and what you took away from that interaction initially weren't completely congruent, and it's in that difference that it feels really interesting and challenging to me. You know what I mean?
I do. Yeah. And maybe, I guess when I know I already cited this, but Patricia Smith saying that when a poem, that a poem is when a narrative is stunned and can't move forward without further commentary is, I heard that, and it's like a kind of religion, it feels like. And so to me, that was a stunned narrative, this story of me at 14 giving a girl who I had a crush on a back massage without saying anything, reaching around, and then having this kind of moment where it was like, oh my God, I think we're I think we're doing it. I think that this is the thing that everyone's told me about. Then, I don't want to, if you're listening, you should just read the poem probably, because I'm going to do a bad job describing it. But then having this, oh no moment where everyone, my friends are like laughing and her friends are laughing and they're all like out in the hallway. And, they're like, I think she's asleep. And then she, getting up saying that she's asleep, and something in me in that moment feeling so desperate to protect myself, saying she wasn't asleep. And in that moment in my body, I was like, I know that she wasn't asleep because I could feel her being awake. Then for years throughout high school, that moment is characterized by an unbelievable amount of shame. And if my friends ever really want to, get me in a way that is rare for friends to want to do, but it does happen from time to time, like they would bring it up and I'd be like, ugh, like I literally physically couldn't even face it at all. And I think, when I wrote that poem, it was trying to slow it down enough. And that's a poem I tried to write so many different times, and they all felt like confession until I was able to sit down and write that poem in the voice of my high school self. And that meant that I had to capture the humor and the joy and the electricity that I felt, and then the kind of cliff fall and the self-protection and all of that, to land on the fact that if I could have looked even for a second longer, I would have seen that it doesn't matter that she wasn't asleep. She was afraid, and that was the most important thing, and that I had made her afraid, and that I too was afraid, and that perhaps there was a relationship between my own fear and the fear I was capable of creating in others. And, that was where it stopped for a while. I started reading that poem out at kind of my own behest, but also some very kind and generous female friends that I have who helped talk with me about the idea that I should probably be sending that to her. And I was so terrified. And so I knew that I was reading it, and I was like, I have to do this. I have to send this to her. If I'm going to end up putting it in a book, if I'm going to be recorded with it, it has to get sent. And so I did. And then she wrote back, and I've never been more grateful to be a writer. I've never been more happy with the tools that we cultivate in terms of trying so desperately to tell a story accurately. She remembered it very, very differently. She said a few things, but she basically was like, I was really into it. I thought you were nice and funny, and I was super into cuddling. So all of that feels right. And then when I heard the laughter in the other room, I thought that you'd planned it, that your friends were in on it, and that the last thing that I could be right now was to be labeled a slut. So I closed my eyes and said I was asleep, and as a way of taking back the power that was mine. And no one could say anything other than that you went up on someone while she was asleep. And I didn't hear that and hear some sort of exoneration or something like that. I was like, I absolutely should not have done that. And in looking at it further, though, I was like, oh my God, I learned the wrong lesson. I'm a 30-something-year-old here having had this formative experience that is characterized by silence that I know many, many people have and don't articulate around, and thus they don't get to look at it accurately. And when that first happened to me, I thought, don't ever do this again, which is so true, right? Great lesson. But I also thought that you were stupid to think that anyone could want to do that with you. And that somehow my fault was thinking that I was worthy of that. And once I had my finger on that, I was like, oh my God, consent and intimacy are so intertwined that it's crazy. Like, the risk wasn't doing it. Like, I guess I had been talking about it with my dad, and he was like, well, you did risk. And not to make my dad sound like an ass, but I think he was just trying to talk through it with me. And I said, yeah, but I didn't risk enough, you know? Risking is asking. Risking is stating your desires and waiting to hear a reply. That's actual vulnerability. And I think just being able to name that the stories I was telling myself about myself were, when plugged into really crazy kind of power dynamics around gender, if I didn't love myself, I was capable of doing incredible damage. And so, you know, this was at a time where I, like many people, are, you know, grappling with their own identities, and me being a straight cis white man was like, oh my God, it's my responsibility to love myself, because there's nothing more dangerous than people in positions of power that are objectifying themselves. And like, from that comes an incredible amount of objectification and potential violence. So that's a long answer around those two poems, but I feel like that was a real journey.
Yeah.
Writing those. And Above Ground was the last poem that went into the book. And it was one that I just was like, this book can't come out without this poem. And so I had to really try to write it.
Yeah. I'm so glad that it did, because it really transforms the experience of the first poem. You know, the first poem is what it is, but without the sort of coda to it that the second poem provides, it kind of means something different, right? And, you know, the thing I think that's so interesting about this, and I think a lot of, like you're saying, a lot of us are right now grappling with identity and what all of this stuff means. And not just from a perspective of like, what does it mean and how do we understand these things like on a surface level, but also like how best to live going forward. Like, what lessons do we need to learn in order to make the world the kind of world that we want to live in and that other people want to live in too?
Yeah.
The thing that I found really important about this pair of poems was the word you used just a minute ago was exoneration. And I feel like there is this whole politics of exoneration that, you know, certain people and certain classes of people are very obsessed with being exonerated, you know? Yeah. There's really not what these poems are trying to do. It's more than that. What I find really interesting is that the poems are neither exonerating your younger self, nor are they just trying to hold your younger self up as like some kind of like a don't do this kind of figure, you know, like it's more complicated than that. And what I think is really valuable about what's in the coda, this thing that you were talking about, is that it moves past that. You know, you can sit in that complexity, but also it's not just the complexity. It's also providing some kind of a instruction, I guess, for like, you know, how do we not do this in the future kind of thing? Like, not to say that you or anybody can provide one, you know, clean answer to that, but this idea of figuring out how to be okay with yourself as a way of ensuring that you treat other people well. I mean, to me, that's something that you can actualize, you know, you can take action on.
Yeah.
And that's what makes, I think, the poems together feel big. You know what I mean?
I do. And don't you, I guess I feel like it's so personal in terms of what makes it not a model, you know, is that the telling of these stories is deeply personal and the details really matter. And the details are oftentimes some of the scariest things that we write. And we have this language or rhetoric of growth and vulnerability. And you can sit there and you can say, I want to grow and I'm vulnerable. And we have these systems of violence in which people's real physical lives and bodies are harmed. And I want to fix it. But that doesn't actually mean that you're doing anything, you know? That the actual movement towards growth is personal. You are kind of your own judge. I mean, this goes for me too. It makes it sound like I'm saying like, you might not be doing anything, and I am, you know? I just know that outside of the book, outside of an audience, outside of a readership, that my capacity to look closely at the handful of stories that make me who I am and to assess them accurately, that is responsible for so many of the best things that have come into my life. Like I look at those two poems and I'm like, my wife and I would not have the relationship that we have if I hadn't prioritized, you know, really trying to figure out who I am, who I actually am and what I've actually done and what has been done to me. And my wife too, of course, you know, obviously she does that as well. But I'm so struck at how much language there is around it and around vulnerability or any of that stuff. And the actual journey there is so personal and so individualized.
Well, I could keep talking about this forever, but why don't we take a quick little break and then come back and do the second segment?
Okay.
So usually I would intro this segment a little differently, but since I've got one of the poetry gods here, I thought I might ask you what's on your mind.
Man, it's good to be back. Yeah, I have two things that are on my mind. One which is literary and one which is liferary. But I think the life one is short, I think. But so I'm a recent dad.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a soon to be 7-month-old son. And, you know, obviously a lot changes when you have kids. But I've been thinking, you know, I've been an uncle for a long time. But what it is to watch someone be born. He was my first person who I ever saw birthed. And to kind of know him since that exact moment means that it's contextualized his age a little different for me. Like 6 months old is 6 months since the day that I was born. And I saw him born that day. So it really is, it's slightly different. It's both his age, but it's also how much time has passed since that moment where he is born and he's a baby. And so one thing that has changed for me that I've been really amazed about is when I see anyone in the world, it babyfies people. Age means something completely different to me. And so literally when I see people who are 42, I'm like, you're a 42-year-old baby. You were born. You're like, as a parent, it's like at 3 months, you start doing this. At 5 months, you can roll over. At 6 months, you start eating solid food, right? And so it's like at 30, you start having existential crises. Like at 42 years development, your knees hurt a lot, right? Like, I don't know. I'm starting to really just think about everything as a stage of development and to just truly understand now that everyone was a baby in a way that I knew, of course, intellectually, but not emotionally, not as an emotional fact. And it really changed the way that I look at the world. And I don't even know exactly how, but I'm like, Vladimir Putin was a baby,
Yeah.
Like, and you can just picture it. In some ways, it, I think, drives home how fallible people are because, you watch your own child kind of, go through their own emotional needs and have desires. You can just picture it. You can really just, I don't know, it softened people in a way that I wasn't expecting.
I find, one of the things that it does for me, I have kids also. I have 3 kids. When my first was born, really when each of them was born, was a really emotional experience for me in a way that I was not prepared for. And actually, when my daughters were born, I had my oldest is my son, and when my daughters were born, I thought that I was ready, and even then, I still wasn't ready for it.
How old are they?
So my oldest is 11, and then my girls are 8 and 5.
That's so old to me.
Yeah, I know. To me too, actually, really. The thing that I think so much about these days is that, like, there's a way in which knowing that somebody was a baby, knowing that my kids were babies, and seeing that, none of my kids are babies anymore. And, none of them are adults either. But I feel like, especially with my eldest, I'm getting glimpses of what he's going to be like as an adult.
Yeah.
And I feel really fortunate because I don't just love my children. I actually really like them. I actually think they are, all 3 of them, really interesting people. And I think they're funny. And I think that, they're just people that I would want to know, even if they weren't my kids. But one of the things that I always think so much about is that, like, there are so many people in this world that I find really unpleasant, or that are just assholes or whatever. And it's not that I never get mad about it anymore, but it's like, having seen my own kids be babies and thinking about the fact that these people were babies, like, it just makes me sad.
Yeah.
It makes me see the whole thing as this tragedy that, like, in a way that I never would have expected before I had my own kids.
Man, that's crazy. Yeah, it also makes you think about your own parents.
Yeah, deeply. Of course.
I mean, I really am like, oh, my perception of what was happening when I was a kid is not their perception. It couldn't be. It's literally impossible.
Yeah.
And that means that there were separate stories going on for everyone, which is a really great lesson too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man, I had one other thing I wanted to say, and now it's gone. Hence the being a parent to a 7-month-old,
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of just walking through life in the middle of a cloud.
It's funny because I feel like that period in my life when my kids were really little, it was a period in which at the same time I felt very present, at least so far as, like, I wasn't able to live in anything outside the moment that I was living in, but also, like, there were, like, whole weeks that would disappear into a fog.
Yeah, man. I really, I was blessed to get up for a drink before Maggie gave birth with my friends. They're writers. Do you know Jeff Kagan Trenchard or Carlos Andres Gomez?
I don't, but I'm going to look them up now.
They're great. Yeah. You should definitely look into them. But they're both dads, and I kind of wanted to get up and just ask them all the questions that I had. And they both were like, yeah, I mean, do I miss, like having 2 hours to just collapse onto the couch and think my own thoughts and tinker around? Of course. But do I miss the kind of, like, aimlessness that comes with that and oftentimes kind of directionlessness that can happen with too much free time? I don't miss it at all. And that has proven out.
Yeah.
I have no time.
Yeah.
I mean, I still find time to sulk, but not much. But the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is I'm a humongous fan of Aracelis Girmay. And really just kind of celebrate. I feel like I've said this before, but I think of her as like if there were aliens who were wanting us to send a representation of the best of humanity, like Ara would be a really great choice. But in her work, if you've read it, she's so good at personification that it's not even necessarily, I think, like a literary device. It's the exact way in which one should use a literary device, which is a tool that serves the content of what it is that you're trying to do. She's never excessive. It's like always spot on. And when asked about it, she said something that really, really stayed with me, where she was kind of talking about how and this happens a lot in Kingdom Animalia, but it happens in a lot of her work, how ascribing the non-human human attributes is a different lens through which to see those human attributes and a different lens through which to understand her own human body, and potentially vice versa. But she had talked about the use of personification being that, you know, if I think about need in the context of the mosquito, like, and I'm writing, say, an ode to a mosquito and describing what a mosquito needs, how might that change the way that I consider need? How might the lens of the mosquito be a new lens to teach me something about need itself? And I think that that's such a important way to think about personification, or the value of something like an ode as a tool that allows you to kind of single out specific things that you deem human and put them on the lens of the outer world. Of course, it like changes the way in which you see mosquitoes, but it also changes the way in which you see desire. And I feel like writers who can grasp that, and obviously Ara does it with personification, but there are so many other literary devices that, when they're rooted so clearly in like a best excavation of content, just really world-changing lenses happen.
You know, I am aware of who she is, and like I've heard a lot of people talk about her. I haven't taken the opportunity to actually read her work yet. I have had Black Maria on my books to buy list for like a while now. This thing that you're saying, though, I think it's interesting because it was also something that I was thinking a bit about in reading your book, which is the way in which art, and in particular writing, and in particular poetry, can collapse the distance between the artist and the subject of the art, or like, you know what I mean? Like, I was thinking about this particularly because several of the poems in your book are written in persona, and obviously persona is not exactly the same as personification of a non-human,
right?
But I feel like it does something similar, or it potentially can do something similar, where it's collapsing that distance.
Yeah,
and it's something that I found really interesting. But also, I'm also aware of how using persona kind of necessarily is fraught. You know, like it's never simple to speak in someone else's voice. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of examples.
Yeah. Like in your poems, you wrote one that was in your mother's voice, which I thought was, to me, this reads like a real act of compassion and empathy. Speaking about how you think about your own parents, but also like, I know that there are examples or even if I don't move off of that example, right, we're like, it is an act of compassion and empathy, and collapsing this distance, even a distance between oneself and someone who is, ought to be very close in our life, but there's still that distance.
Yeah.
But then also, like, even though it feels like a kindness, it feels like empathy, it feels beneficial. Like I was thinking, like there's still something fraught about that. There's still something that is complicated about doing that. About speaking in somebody else's voice. And I never came to any conclusions about it, but it was something that was sort of like, tingly in my brain.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the fraught nature about it to me comes with publishing, comes with sharing those works. And, there are longer journeys that those poems go on before they get shared. Mm-hmm. I'm always a little suspicious when I'm writing and I'm like, this is fraught, so I'm not going to try it in my own notebook, because I know the rules. And the rules are that there are 99 ways to do this wrong and one way to do it right, or something like that, And so in writing those, that one about my mom, the origin story, this was at a time, and you can kind of see it in the book, where I'm like, really, I was just like desperately trying to get to the bottom of who my mom was and how she became this kind person who she is today, and what were the stories that led up to it. And I was really grateful for that level of curiosity. And so that was a story that she told me that really stayed with me. And then I sat down one morning and was kind of surprised that that was what was coming out, but I was trying to just listen to the voice. And then, of course, the next thing that you do is I shared it with her. And I don't know, there's something really gratifying in sharing a poem about someone. And I think it's telling that, those persona poems, like I'm trying to think of others, but it's like in my mom's voice, there's one about my brother for his wedding that is really basically, if not a persona poem, it's just like in the second person. And it's all about him and his husband. And, there's something really gratifying in the exercise, using the arts as an exercise to actively try to see and articulate something about this person that you love, and using their voice as a means to do that. But also, I think the sharing with them and having them say, yeah, that's it, having them be grateful and to say that you did it accurately. And that doesn't take away the risk of it, And honestly, the harm that can be done in writing persona work carelessly or thoughtlessly, right? Mm-hmm. But those were like two instances where I was really trying to think about this person who I both love and know so well, and to stretch the ceiling and walls of that knowing.
Yeah. Another thing that I was just thinking of, to go back to this sort of question of, making use of literary devices as a tool to support what the work is about, kind of thing, which, on one level kind of seems like it ought to be obvious, but I think it isn't. But, because a lot of times I think when we write, or when we make our work, we might get interested in a technique or a tool or something, and just kind of like, I got a hammer here, and let me find some nails, kind of thing. I'm also thinking about how the way that you're describing Aracelis Girmay's work, that it almost seems like it's starting from the question of like what can I learn from thinking about a mosquito, right? Like it almost seems like it's starting from the question of, if I would like to personify an animal, and what can I learn from doing that? And to me, like, that's like a really like opposite way that I usually approach my own writing. Like, to me, I'm usually writing from a place of like, I have a thing that I want to describe. Now, like, what can I bring to this out of all of my tool set that will be the right way to describe it? But like the idea of taking, like, here's a tool, and like, what could I make with this tool, seems like a very generative thing that like I've never really done before, but it seems interesting.
Oh man, I just learned this term. I know it's in the romance world. My wife is a romance author, but it's just a literary term, but she said there are pantsers and there are planners.
Yeah. Leah, I have a lot of science fiction writer friends, and that's the same thing. Yeah.
Oh man, I am an absolute pantser to my core. And pantser is obviously just, someone who goes by the seat of their pants. And so I really feel, it's not that I don't know the stories that are, most urgent for me, but oftentimes if I sit down and I'm like, today is the day I will write that, it falls flat. It is denied its entry point for me. And this is just personal, right? Like a lot of times my ability to succeed in a poem depends on my ear to know when that specific poem is knocking and to be surprised by it. And it never looks exactly how I thought it would look or think it's going to look. And I oftentimes have things to say that I didn't know I had to say, or context that I didn't know needed to be provided. But I really try to just make the space and start. And it's so funny. Like the book starts with this, can I hand you my backpack and get loose? Like kind of line. But that sentiment is probably at the beginning of, I don't know, maybe 75% of the first drafts that I've ever written, and then later crossed out because it's just like a kind of urge to just, can I loosen up a little bit? Can I get ready to find out what on earth it is that I actually have to say today? And so that's very oftentimes tool oriented, I'll start by just trying to mess with something, and kind of go from there and let it take shape.
Yeah. So there's one question that I like to end with, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, I think, but the question is, if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah. There's so many. You must have people just all the time being like, there's so many. And that meant something to me in a way that I could articulate. You know what? It didn't come out recently, but it's been something I've been thinking about for a really long time. I'm a really big Frank Ocean fan. And the journey between Channel Orange and Blonde has, I think, a lot about these two songs. There's one song at the end of Channel Orange that's Bad Religion, which kind of locates the speaker in the back of a taxi cab, feeling like there's nowhere else to go and kind of confessing to the taxi driver. And there's this sense of desperation and unrequited love that informs that moment in that song. And then when Blonde came out, there was a song that I think is actually the same number in the album. I feel like they're both track 12 or 13. And that song is called Godspeed. And I could be totally wrong, but it feels like a love song to the same person. And it's like, I let go of a prayer for you, just a sweet word. I let go of my claim on you. It's a free world. And just like kind of these incredibly, to me, profound, movements towards what it is to recognize what unrequited love functions as sometimes, which is like a personal claim on someone who is free to make their own decisions. And both songs are so impactful and so profound. And I think about them both because I think sometimes when we sit down to write, we want to get the capital A answer instead of understanding the snapshot of the moment that we're at and giving ourselves full permission to just truly try to name the emotional landscape as it is. right now. Even if it's a recollection, you're still kind of naming your own emotional landscape as it is as an observer. And I just was so grateful that when Frank Ocean was making Channel Orange, that he didn't try to write Godspeed when the actual song he needed to write was Bad Religion. And there's a lot of faith in that act of telling today's story, of writing today's thing, that I think paved the way for him to be able to write Godspeed, which to me is a profound song, and it's so beautiful. And I don't think it would be possible without the allowance of Bad Religion.
Well, thank you. And thanks so much for talking with me. I really had a good time.
Yeah, me too. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Jon's book, It's Not Magic, is available now from Beacon Press. You can order it directly from the publisher at beacon.org, or you can buy it wherever books are sold. There's also a link in the show notes, and I highly recommend getting yourself a copy. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode was done by Callie Wright. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. You can find all of the show's social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechannelopen.com. And if you'd like to support the show, you can make a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia. A $5 monthly pledge gets you access to our bonus audio archive, which includes readings from guests of Keep the Channel Open and interviews with the authors of Likewise Fiction. Coming up next week on Likewise Fiction, I'll be featuring Evangelina Concepcion by Ani Sison Cooney. That will air on March 16th, and you can find that at likewisefiction.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Keep the Channel Open will be back on March 25th, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.